finish their lunch. I'll talk for maybe 10 minutes and then turn to Mark and then to Harvey to kind of close up the discussion, hopefully leaving the time for comments and questions. First, I want to thank the Georgetown University Press for being tolerant with Harvey and I and being late in our various deadlines. But when you have a dozen or more chapters written by a dozen or more authors with different deadlines and schedules, it's often hard to get it all together. But I think the second edition is much superior to the first edition, not only because we've updated it and added some new chapters, but I think it also kind of tries to treat the issue of organizational culture in a more serious fashion. I think you just hear from our comments today, that's the key theme of the book. I also want to thank the Security Studies program. I've been associated with it since 2005 when I was an adjunct teaching full-time at the National War College.
That's right, I forgot to say that. The most important thing, he used to teach how the government works.
Right.
That was he taught that as an adjunct, and you unfortunately don't get to experience that.
And that leads actually to sort of a discussion of why we did the book. And when I taught the course, which I called How Washington Works here at Georgetown, and when Harvey and I were teaching a course we called Domestic Factors in National Security Decision-Making, we quickly realized that there is no book that really looks at the role of organizational cultures. I mean, much of the work that we all read, how national security decision-making is accomplished, is sort of an outside-in look, looking at various decision structures, and it gives brief mention to the Department of State, Defense, the intelligence community. Maybe in a really good textbook on American foreign policy making, you'll have one chapter devoted to the entire set of agencies. And you'll maybe have a page or two about the State Department or Defense Department. Our book is instead sort of an inside-out look, looking at those parts that fit on those decision-making decision trees, getting inside the State Department, inside the Pentagon, inside the intelligence community, try to explain the importance of the different cultures. And I'm not going to try to summarize the book this morning. Hopefully some of you have read the first edition. Maybe you'll be willing to take on the second edition, which includes really excellent chapters on AID. We have the author here today, Terry Myers, another colleague from War College. And a chapter on the role of the Treasury Department in national security making, which I think increasingly is one of the tools we're using that Harvey and Dina Temple-Raston co-authored. So they all look at the insides of these organizations. And some of the key themes of the book are simply that organizational cultures matter, but very few people understand them. Now, from a scholar's perspective, it's important to understand these cultures, partly because it will help you understand how decisions are made. And if you've read The Essence of Decision by Graham Allison and Phil Zelikow, one of the points they want to underline is the organizational politics model that they talk about is not really predictive, because you don't know all the ingredients that are going into a decision until it's actually made. It's only later when you read memoirs and memos that you can see, this is the way State Department played the issue, or defense, or the intelligence community. So it's not predictive, but it will at least bound some level of uncertainty about the process if you understand how state or defense generally approach the making of foreign policy. But for a practitioner, which most of our authors were, it also helps practitioners understand cultures that they didn't work in. And one of my experiences, having worked at CIA for 20 years and 10 more years in other places, the NIC, the National Intelligence Council, State Department, both policy planning staff and then overseas, and defense in the ISA when Joe Nye was my assistant secretary, is that these cultures are so different, and yet we operate in our own little cocoon at CIA or DIA or State Department, not really understanding how these cultures, other cultures operate, what their real priorities or understandings are. And just to give you a couple of quick examples, compare how CIA and FBI approach interrogation of detainees. CIA is wanting to get as much information as fast as possible to prevent future attacks. FBI is a law enforcement agency. It wants evidence that will hold up in court, that is not tainted by the use of extreme interrogation methods that will be thrown out. And just that one simple example shows you how the priorities, missions, and preferences of these two very important organizations are at loggerheads sometimes, and they cannot work very well together. I mean, another comparison, and Mark may say more about this in his own chapter, is compare state and defense. State has very few, I know it seems like a lot to many of those outside the US government, very few political appointees compared to defense. Mark is a good example of a careerist who has made it up through the ranks from a lowly junior foreign service officer to a desk officer to a political counselor to an ambassador to an assistant secretary of state to an undersecretary of state for policy. You cannot find anyone like that in the Department of Defense. With rare exceptions, you'll find an assistant secretary who is a careerist. They're all political appointees, almost all. And undersecretaries is the same case in the policy area. So you have different kinds of cultures working in different agencies.
Listen, Mark, weren't you in the end a special envoy?
Finally,
Special envoy.
Yeah, he has many more titles we could have. So just to get those two examples, to understand how different organizations operate, you need to go deeper than the typical textbook on foreign policy decision making. And each of our chapters tries to unfold how DoD, AID, State Department, CIA differ. And I'm just going to quickly run through a couple of key points about the CIA to kind of give you an illustration of the chapters. This is a chapter I wrote, so any errors of commission are mine, and I know Peter's here, it's from other people who have lived through the agency as well, so they may have slightly different views.
Both you know, editing Roger is always complicated.
No, I've edited you a bit too. Legal briefs, very long. In my case, I think there are three concepts that kind of capture the essence of the agency. First one is presidential focus. The second one I would term secrets RS. And the third one is non-political. And in each way, I think these three principles come together to describe and help us understand how the CIA operates. Now, presidential is critical because when the national security system was set up in 1947, I know you all know this history, CIA was one of the agencies created along with the National Security Council. It's the only agency that does not report to a department secretary. It reports to the President and the National Security Council. That unique feature alone describes a lot of why CIA is what it is today. Because without presidential involvement, we wouldn't have a CIA. Military services were content to do military intelligence. The FBI was content to do domestic intelligence in the 1940s. And it was only this presidential directive that allowed us to create a central intelligence agency. So the CIA sees the president as our #1 customer. In fact, in the 1990s, and Peter will remember this, we had a saying, the so-called first customer was the president, serve the president. And we even had a logo, which I thought was silly at the time with the White House, and on top was the CIA logo. I thought, if anything, it should be underneath, right? That didn't last long. But the point was, we were working for the president. And yes, the National Security Council and other national security agencies, but everything revolved around the president. The president's daily brief, covert action authorities. Any analysis that was going to be done had to be according to his agenda. And we were all always trembling with every presidential transition. Is this next president going to want us to work with him? And we can talk a bit in Q&A about President Trump. So that presidential focus is unique. Other agencies do not approach their jobs in that same fashion, at least from an intelligence perspective. The second point is secrets RS. Secrets are central to the way the CIA operates. And I would contrast that with the State Department. If you think about CIA being classified, closed, covert, think of the State Department as transparent. Because their mission is outreach, getting out, interacting with foreign governments, foreign publics, to shape their opinions of the United States. Ours is not. Ours is inward looking. We want to keep things secret. We want to keep things secret because we have to protect sources. We want to keep covert actions secret because they're sensitive operations where lives are at risk. And we want to keep our judgments secret that we're providing to the president so we can give our policymakers decision advantage. So the adversary doesn't know what we're thinking, how we assess them. So for all those reasons, secrets really are vital to our mission. That's the good side. The bad side is we don't share information all that well. Even after the 9/11 attack and the mantra that there's a need to share, the need to know principle is pretty much alive and well. And I think the WikiLeaks and the Snowden affairs have combined to cause us to be very sensitive about outreach to foreign officials or to even non-government US experts. Outreach is difficult for CIA. I've always envied state I&R because, again, state I&R officers could interact with academics, with foreign officials, go into a foreign ministry as part of their official foreign TDY trips, whereas a CIA analyst was made to feel uncomfortable trying to make those kinds of contacts. So outreach suffers as a result of that. Secrecy also can hide some of our mistakes. And I think we find out that too much secrecy, too much need to know can prevent enough wise advice to avoid some of the problems we've actually encountered. So we have to kind of deal with that problem of secrecy, both the good and the bad. Lastly, non-political, and I would say, to provide objective analysis, we cannot be seen to have a political agenda of our own. We want to be working for every president, Democrat or Republican. And the problem we face with every transition is that it takes at least a year for the new team to accept that, yes, we are working for you. Yes, you worked 8 years for George Bush. It took us a while for the Obama team to believe we weren't representing Bush policies or had Bush biases. And likewise, it's going to take a while, and it's taking perhaps longer for the new Trump team to accept that, no, we're not, a bunch of liberal Democrats trying to push Obama policies. It's particularly complicated with the Russian hacking story right now. But in the end, I think most presidents and their teams come to realize CIA is better served by being non-political, so you can get an objective view and not having to worry about whether there's a political agenda or bias out at Langley. And as a result, again, to compare it to state and defense, we have maybe 3 political appointees in the entire CIA: director, deputy director, and inspector general.
And general counsel.
And general counsel, if we can get one. So that prevents, the politicization of intelligence from the top. And you'll also notice that most directors who have succeeded have been ones who haven't brought in their cronies. I'll name 2 that didn't do so well. Stansfield Turner brought in his Navy lieutenant commanders and commanders and created kind of a team around him. And Porterdas from the HIPSI committee brought in his goslings, as we called them. And neither one did particularly well and didn't survive. General Hayden, on the contrast, Panetta had not done that, and to my knowledge, I don't think Michael Pompeo has brought in a large group of cronies to help run the agency, because that has not been seen as a professional way to run CIA. CIA is not political. So I'll close just by saying, if you look at all 3 of these factors, Trump presents a particular challenge, and that is, it puts CIA at odds with its first customer. It exposes the agency to politicization, that it's being pulled into the politics. And it's forcing us, I think, eventually to have to provide more information, declassify more information to make some of our views known, which again sort of violates that secrecy principle. And in all three cases, it sort of undermines the organizational culture of CIA. So with that, I'll close and turn it over to Mark to kind of talk a bit about your chapter and state's culture and the current situation.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Well, thank you all very much for coming, first of all. And thank you for kind of going through all those various titles. One of the great things about being in front of a Washington audience is everyone says, yeah, I got it, title. So I was, a few weeks ago, outside, I was in Montgomery, Alabama, and I was giving a talk at a World Affairs Council, and someone was kind enough to give me a nice introduction. And finally got lost in all the titles and said, here's Ambassador Grossman with an extinguished career. And I thought, well, that's how this goes. But anyway, I also want to sort of give some thank yous. First to Harvey Rishikof for giving me the opportunity to be involved in the first one and then also the second. Georgetown University Press, very interesting engagement. I've never done anything like this before. And also to Georgetown, where I've now been 9 years in the MSFS program and have the good fortune to teach second-year master's students mostly, and which is fantastic. So a lot of what I learned from them, I think, is reflected in this book, and certainly a lot of things I read was reflected in getting ready for these classes. So I really appreciate it. The job I've been given today is to talk a little bit, not so much about the chapter, but whether sort of what's going on at the State Department today, really to go to your question, sort of what's the future, and whether there's anything that you can draw from the chapter to kind of help you think about things going forward. So, like Roger, I'll make a couple of 3 points. First of all, one of the most interesting things to me over these past few months is that the very first point that we make in this chapter, which is that, like many other government agencies, the State Department's got a culture that's founded first and foremost on patriotism and service to country, and the desire to come and do the right thing every single day, has been, interestingly, very much confirmed by the very work that Secretary Tillerson had engaged or sort of contracted for with an outside consultancy. And you'll recall that some months ago they gave a contract, they were going to talk to lots of people. And if you look at that report, what's the first finding of that report? First finding of that report is, what do you know? State Department people are, Foreign Service and Civil Service, very patriotic, right? And they're interested in serving the United States of America, and they're interested in being led, right? They want to be part of something that's happening. Now, my parenthesis to this has always been, who thought otherwise, but leave that be. That the culture of the department that is identified in this book is now kind of again brought forward, it seems to me, today in this study that's been done. And that's a very important thing, and to me, very helpful, which means that the rhetoric of people who are in the department or outside the department who are trying to answer this question of what's the future of the State Department can be that fundamentally, like other people in the national security space, you have people in the State Department, Foreign Service and Civil Service, who are interested in service. That's why they're there. That's why they got there. And I'll come back to that at the very end of my talk. Second, and that is the interesting thing to me at the moment, is that there's this debate in the State Department over change. Right? And that what's been set up is kind of two camps. There's a Secretary of State camp where they're working on reorganization and they're working on things that ought to change. And then somehow, some way, it's the sort of culture has developed that there's another camp in which there are Foreign Service and Civil Service people. In other words, the permanent bureaucracy, right? The people who work there every single day. Now, what's interesting to me, and again, reflected, I think, in the chapter, is that if you step back, you think one of the great missed opportunities right here, right now, is that what do most Foreign Service people and most Civil Service people want about the State Department? They want it to change, right? They recognize that it can't go on the way it is because it's impossible to get your work done. It's impossible to serve the president. It's impossible to do the kinds of things that you want to do when you join the Foreign Service or the Civil Service, right? As shown by the consultant's report. So so I think one of the challenges at the moment is to sort of bring these two lines together so that Secretary Tillerson and the people who are working with him don't believe that somehow out there are a lot of people who are opposed to change. and that the people who are working in the State Department today, and I would say AIG today as well, if you'd allow me, are also interested in a new way of doing business, because the old way, is the old way, right? And here's a chance to do something new. So let me give you a couple examples. One of the very first things that Secretary Tillerson did was he took that there were 2 deputy secretaries of state, right, came after Colin Powell, and he made him 1. Well, that's terrific, right, and ought to be applauded, and everybody's, and lots of people have said so. So that's the kind of thing, sort of right off the bat, that ought to be a positive. Similarly, I think, and as Harvey said, I'm guilty. I was a special envoy. I was a special envoy for Afghanistan and Pakistan. But one of the things that Secretary Tillerson did, I think, rightly again, was to get rid of a lot of these special envoys. I think they've come up to like 140 some odd of these people who were additional bureaucracy, outside the bureaus, doing all these kinds of things. And, the number of special envoys and representatives over the period of an administration is not going to be 0, right? Because a lot of them are political. Sometimes it's necessary, but 149, 150, whatever the number got to, was way, way, way too much. And I think that was widely applauded at the State Department. Right? The less people who are outside of the chain of command, the better off it is for the people who are trying to make this deal work. And so I think that there's already been some examples of where change on the Secretary of State side and change as seen from Foreign Service and Civil Service people are broadly agreed. And I think if you took the next step in this, it would be a very exciting thing, right? So for example, there's probably a way to get rid of 1 DAS per bureau, right? One of the things we talked about in the book was the clearance process, right? And trying to get anything through this machine. So 1 DAS a bureau, gone, okay with me, as long as political appointees and Foreign Service and Civil Service people come at this equally, right? Yeah. Similarly, you could probably at the State Department deal with 1 or maybe even 2 less bureaus, right? That means you could probably deal with 1 less Undersecretary of State. So I think all of those things would be warmly welcomed by the people who work at the State Department. And so the job now, it seems to me, is to try to bring these 2 lines together. Now there's a couple of things that, obviously, as you make change at the State Department, as important it is to do, that, in my view anyway, and again, kind of shown, I think, a little bit by the chapter, there are 3 or 4 things that those of us who are now on the outside, and if we had a chance to make any recommendations, would say, so here's some things to watch out for, right? Number 1, so try to make this conversation about what the future of the State Department is, make it public, right? So don't make this conversation between Secretary Tillerson and his group and somebody at OMB, and then bam, suddenly somebody comes out with a reorganization plan, right? So you might as well take advantage of the fact that there are people inside and outside of the State Department who are interested in change. So have it be a public debate. Because, sir, I think that's a fundamental kind of way to start the conversation of what's the future of the State Department, as I'll say in a minute or 2, what's the future of diplomacy, right? So public rather than private. 2 is that if you're going to make cuts, again, which I think the State Department absolutely needs, sort of focus on domestic and not abroad, right? Because where's our work done? Our work is done mostly abroad, right? And so you want to pay attention to the front end of our business, which is diplomats serving abroad, civil service people serving abroad, and other people from other agencies serving abroad as well. So if you've got a bias, make it a bias toward strengthening the overseas aspect of it. And third, I think very relevant to, I hope, a number of people in this room, right, is don't stop hiring. So you need to continue to have new people coming into this department. And we had the experience in the first Clinton administration of hiring 0 people for a couple of years. And that was a problem that we paid for 30 years, right? There were always too few people moving along through the promotion system. And a little bit like the military, we lose several hundred people a year because it's an up-or-out system, right? So people get old, people don't meet the standard, people retire. So there are people moving out at the upper end. You need to have people come in at the lower end. And that's not just PMS, and it's not just Pickering Fellows, and it's not just Wrangell Fellows, but it's hiring for the Foreign Service and the Civil Service. And then remember these other things. But they are, it seems to me, part of this larger debate about how to bring this culture forward into the future. One of the things, obviously, we were not able, it seems to me, to deal with because it moves so fast in terms of culture, is the other reason that you need new people, is you need new people because you're dealing now in a new kind of diplomacy on social media with all of these kinds of the electronics, the sort of new ways of thinking. And then as Roger said, yes, it's part of the job to be out and among people and and be forward, that's all good. But there's also now an enormous effort on the electronic side, and the younger your people, the more likely you're going to get that done in the right way. Third point, and that goes to your question, which is the future of the State Department. And I think that's part of the question, but what's really the interesting question right now is what's the future of diplomacy, right? And what's the future of U.S. diplomacy, but also kind of the kinds of things that we've come to do with our allies, come to do with coalitions, come to do with the kinds of issues around the world where you need more than one country to get this job done. And if you look at President Trump's speech to the United Nations General Assembly, right? If you look at the Wall Street Journal article that the National Security Advisor and Gary Cohn put together, about the kind of world that they think about, right? Which is a world in which there's competition, which is absolutely true, a world in which nation states are strong among themselves. So the next phase of this is, so what diplomacy follows? And if you can answer that question, then the answer is, what kind of State Department do you need to promote that kind of diplomacy? Final point, and that is, you can imagine that a lot of people, because I believe that the hiring question will kind of move forward. I hope that will be a winning argument to people who are doing reorganization. As people are asking, so should I go into the State Department? Should I become a foreign service officer? Should I become a civil service officer at the Department of State? And my answer to people is absolutely, right? Because you got to play for the long term here, right? Which is to say that the United States is going to need diplomats, diplomacy, and in whatever that form looks like for many, many years to come, and we're going to need that, right? It isn't going to go away. It might change, and probably will change, probably ought to change. But the idea that you still have the opportunity to serve in the Foreign Service, in the Civil Service, for the Department of State is still a very powerful one. So when I look at my students in Georgetown, and I have 4 that are, going in already, and a number who would like to proceed, when they have doubts, I try to tell them, no, it's a great thing. Being part of our diplomacy is important. You got to pursue it, and you got to pursue it, as enthusiastically as you can. So, as I say, I think that the foundational point in the book is this is a culture that's founded on service and patriotism, that there's change to come, and we ought to be doing it with the leadership, not against the leadership, and that the future of diplomacy has got to be one in which people are involved. I think none of the things that are said today contradict, but maybe even support the chapter that we've got in the book.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm going to be very brief because I think it will be much more fun to engage the audience. We have a number of the authors here, so I want to give them also an opportunity to ask questions or make comments. I'd be negligent if I didn't thank our Georgetown Press that's sitting in the back of the room there, who's been a real friend to, I think, these issues and showed extraordinary patience working with us and allowed us at the end, if you look at the book, it's rather critical because the spine has an individual that looks a lot like Johnny Walker, which we think is critical when you do this for a business, at the end of the day, how you actually are able to do this, but there's been no copyright infringements or patent infringements.
I thought it was still on.
Exactly. And then I want to thank Georgetown, of course, and then David for being so generous in doing this forum. So, and then I have to, as many of you in the room, remember what it was like to be a government official. I have to make the caveat that these are my remarks alone. I'm not representing the Department of Defense or the United States government or the American Bar Association or any other organizations that I'm affiliated with. So we did the book, as Roger said, the second edition. And what's different about the second edition is we had every author rewrite every chapter. And we added new chapters. So it's a totally new take on the issues. So we encourage you for that, and we added some chapters, and one of the chapters we added was that I co-authored with Dina Temple-Raston, which we call Brogues on the Ground, which is the role of the Treasury Department. And what helped bring that was the Donnellan quote in which we opened the chapter, which is, Treasury is at the table and has been at the table for addressing some of our most important security issues, national security issues, whether it be the terrorist threat, or it be the North Korean challenge, or the non-proliferation challenge in Iran. When you think about that in our generation, having Treasury being such an extraordinary, important instrument with its statutory power of being able to follow the money, and for those of us who are old enough to remember, that's how one president was taken down. Following the money in an international perspective in the form of national security threats, we think has become an unheralded procedure that increasingly has been evolved in our foreign policy to get people's attention. And, you know, starting with the executive order that was passed in September 23rd, 2001, we know it as 13224, you begin to see this growing power of Treasury, the growing power of how you target and reach individuals. And as my father always used to say, it's extraordinary what happens when you freeze someone's bank account, how you can get their attention. And that is a large aspect of what we can do at Treasury. And then the other element that we worked with, which I think was hard to get as a moving target, was the media issue. So we wrote this just on the cusp of the two major problems we had with a range of, quote, individuals who had put extraordinary amounts of classified information into the system. You know it as WikiLeaks, or the other, Mr. Assange's set of dumps that took place. And we saw this as a transformative moment for the intelligence community and media. And we tried to put that in the context of how different this is. And when I was at the DNI working with counterintelligence, we thought this was a experience in which a quantitative change actually became qualitative. We had never seen this amount of classified information being placed into the wild and being used for a variety of nefarious reasons. But the quote that we had, which I think you'll find fascinating, is it's not so new about how the government feels about the press. And the quote is, "I hate newspapers. They come into camp and pick up their camp rumors, print them as facts. I regard them as spies, which in truth they are. If I killed them all, there would be news from hell before breakfast." And that's, of course, General William Sherman. So this idea of this being new it's new on scale because of social media, but the idea of false facts or rumors or how this is now able to go around the world because of social media and what's happening in the system is a problem we've had before, but the problem has now been scaled in a way that is creating a lot of things for us to think through about how to deal with it. And I would say the logic of why we thought the book was important, and we originally conceived it as if you had a rabbi in your organizations. I don't know if you know the phrase a rabbi, but it's usually a mentor or someone who's an older individual inside the organization. And you went to them as a young member of either the Bureau or the agency or the State Department or Treasury. We thought this is what your rabbi would tell you about the culture of your organization, how you get ahead, what you have to do or not do inside the system in order to rise through the ranks the way either Roger or Mark have risen through their ranks. I've been in so many different institutions that it's been difficult for me to rise because I usually arrive at the top and then leave rather quickly. So, but it's demonstrated the level of different cultures that we deal with when you have to do the interagency phenomena. And I would end it with Michel's quote, which we used to conclude, which is that, to put it bluntly, we are trying to face the 21st century threats with a bureaucracy that sometimes seems designed for the Byzantine Empire, which, as you call, didn't end well. We are still often too rigid, and when we need to be flexible, too clumsy, when we need to be agile, slow, when we need to be fast, too focused on individual agency equities, when we need to be focused on the broader whole of government's mission. So I think we began to see that we were in a transformation, we're in a transition stage. It's clearly, as you know, the Obama administration's approach to bureaucracy was the creation of an extraordinary number of special envoys. I used to have a graph that, I forget who put it together for us, but it literally looked like a constellation in which all the special envoys were created for all of the issues, because the White House's, I would say, lack of feeling that the bureaucracies were responsive to them. So they created almost a parallel entity. And we've seen this phenomenon. We also have a chapter on the NSC, so I don't know how many of you remember, but it actually yesterday was the 70th birthday of the creation of the National Security Council. And when you think, yes, and when you think of the iterations of the NSC, it is quite fascinating as each president takes an NSC to confront the range of threats and problems. So we have an introduction that was written by the legendary and extraordinary Scowcroft. So Scowcroft wrote the introduction. I think Scowcroft has finally convinced me. I don't know if he's convinced Roger. And Scowcroft's position was that he believed the NSC should be about 50 people. And 50 people who were extraordinarily capable. And that they would help to focus an issue or problem for the president. And that they would not be an alternative form of government entity or process, either a new OSD or a new State Department. And the last administration had, I think, a NSC number of around 350. I think our current NSC is about around 250 now. And you'll be happy to know that I presented a copy of the book to the Chief of Staff of the NSC, an old friend, and explained to him that both for HR and Tom Bossett, that all the answers are in the book. It just requires them to sit down and read it and then operationalize it. And of course, the Chief of Staff is always happy to see me and was particularly happy to see that I gave him yet another reading assignment. He thought he was beyond that. But I think that structural issue of our current bureaucracy and bureaucratic structures, given the current problem set and the role of technology that Mark alluded to, is really requiring us, if you're a state manager, to think about the process. And many of you in this room know what it's like to be hired by the federal government. And that process, I think, could be vastly improved. And I'll end with this remark, which is odd for officers, that's the way we are. So in our entire book, we sort of raise these issues, and it's a massive view for students and for practitioners, because as you see, the array of authors are the who's who of former sort of mandarins of the bureaucratic process inside our worlds. But what's never mentioned, and increasingly for me has become an issue, and that has seized particularly DOD and some other relevant component parts of the national security state, is the concept of supply chain. So we never mention supply chain in the book. And I think when we do the third edition, inshallah, that's another extraordinary problem based on the cyber issue of software, hardware, we call carbon units, you know them as people, and the ISPs, the Internet Service Providers. That supply chain problem and making sure that our platforms have uncompromised capabilities and that information can flow in the system, that we are confident is the information we want to flow and is appropriately controlled, is another 21st century issue that if we don't get right, it will be extraordinarily complicated for us when we try to project force, when we use the agency for information campaigns. And it's a fascinating issue that we did the whole book, and that this issue, while we're writing, it was sort of in the back of my mind as an issue about how to address. And now, increasingly, back as being a practitioner, seeing how significant that issue is for us to be able to feel comfortable and confident that when we give the order to shoot, that the projectile ends up where it's supposed to go and has it in the way that we want it to, without any deep compromise. And then the other part is that social media, which we did not deal with, but touched on, which is, quote, the fake news. But as I pointed out, Sherman had similar problems. But the scale of the issue now has changed us as to think about it in a significant way. And I see when we have another co-author, Rogers, about how do we keep secrets? That increasingly the keeping of secrets for the nation state is a very, very difficult and complex issue. And that has changed the game dramatically as a game changer about the operating field for the state as it tries to do X or Y with the fear of what that may mean if what they're doing is being revealed ultimately to the jury of the general public and the public will. So with that, I'll stop and open it up to the audience and our authors if they'd like to make comments or ask questions.
Yeah, there are a couple other mandarins here.
I know, yes.
Terry Myers, who is the author of our USAID chapter, and Joe McMillan, who's a co-author of the Department of Defense
And we
Secretary.
have one of the savants from Rands now, so they spend a lot of time sitting there, quietly.
Right, former NSC survivor.
For NSC, is that right?
So before you, I just want to take the prerogative here and thank you for the great remarks here. And I do think that this book is really important, and of course I commend it, not just because I know some of the authors there, but a burning question that I have is that we have only seen real change to the national security apparatus really when Congress intervenes. 1947, 1987, and Goldwater Nichols. And do you see the current dysfunctional Congress notwithstanding, do you see potential for Congress to intervene and give some direction to the future of the national security apparatus and to make any kind of radical changes?
We'll go down the road. Mark, do you want to take that? And then we'll go to Roger.
I mean, because the executive branch has not really demonstrated the ability to make
A more recent change, though, I think, that affected the national security enterprise, obviously, was 911, when we created the Department of Homeland Security. We had a Homeland Security Council for a while that then gets fed into.
that was still
the
congressionally.
It was,
directed.
no, it's supporting your point that Congress gets active when there's a major failure of some sort. And hate to say it, maybe another failure is going to be necessary to shake people out of their lethargy to create a new system. I don't agree with that.
Well, I think in terms of kind of recent news, the Congress has intervened, actually. I mean, if you think of the budget that, for the State Department anyway, and for AID, that went to Congress, Congress said, no, we're not actually going to make that size cut. And we're going to put money back into the budget because we actually believe in diplomacy. And so, from my perspective anyway, there are still kind of pieces of the larger enterprise with Congress there that have a longer-term interest. Now, I don't know how the budget will ultimately turn out, but I do think it was an important signal to, first of all, the people who work at the State Department, people who work in the civilian part of national security, and also to our friends and allies that there was going to be a debate about what the future was here. So, and in the very short term, I think there's been some positive activity. The question I think is one you posed, which is what's going forward. So a little bit like the other structures, we still have structures at the State Department that are now getting on 30, 40 years old. And you think of the Foreign Service Act of 1980, which was a very interesting collaboration between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And it's got some pluses, got some minuses. I think overall it's been a very effective way to kind of think through diplomacy in the world. It's served us extremely well. But, come 2020, it's 40 years old. So the question is whether you kind of want to delve in some executive branch, legislative branch combine to do something about the fundamental structures. The other thing is whether the Congress, and I think it can continue to encourage the very important point that Harvey made, which is that going forward, whether there are special envoys or not, going forward, the answer to more and more of these questions is the whole of government approach. So if you're working toward a whole of government approach on the executive side, then you also need to work toward a whole of government approach on the congressional side.
Fix the committees.
Really hard, but if you look at a couple of examples over the past few years, Plan Columbia being one of them, even though lots of committees were involved in Plan Columbia, there was a coalition of people both in the House and the Senate who supported this whole of government effort. And it was hard work, and it was daily work, and it was garden tending work on both sides, but it got done. And so this can be done. I think that's part of the answer as well.
So I would distinguish the question into two parts. So the first part is, what is the role of Congress in helping to get involved in shaping America's foreign policy? So there, as you know, we've had a seesaw battle over the history of the Republic. But I say increasingly you've seen Congress leaning forward on what the sanctions should be vis-a-vis certain opponents, and removing it from the executive discretionary decision to a more statutory congressional concurrence. That's a great separation of powers issue, and I think we've had, this Congress has been had a larger appetite, and that means constraining the executive and the executive branch free maneuvering as to how to decide how to apply pressure to put it on or take it off. So that's one issue. That's a great, fascinating question. The second issue, which I think you were implying, was, because when you think of the 1947 Act, it's allocating responsibilities, we used to call it roles and missions, sometimes roles and fictions, as to what the capacity is of different component parts of the enterprise. I think it's always awkward when the Congress tries to legislate, which they have, as you know, there's caps on how many people can actually be at the NSC. There are caps that are put, which has a real structural impact on the executive branch to organize. And there, I think, though you said there hasn't been much change, if you look at the NSC, we've had more changes in the structure of the National Security Council in the last 16 to 18 years than we had in the previous almost 50 years. So we've always had a functional, geographic way of trying to figure out how to allocate it. But don't forget, the bringing in of the whole Homeland Security into the NSC is a revolutionary thing. Historically, America's had a cultural DNA aversion to that. We don't have a Home Secretary. So to have now a Secretary of DHS that sits astride an apartment, which the chapter in the book does a very elegant job of doing it, that Susan does, of laying out the power of the equivalence of almost an Attorney General. That's revolutionary. Don't forget, we also created inside the Department of Justice for the first time a National Security Division. And that National Security Division is the point for a whole range of, so there has been some evolution and change, but I think the harder question is how the Congress and the executive branch can work together to put a set of processes that creates that flexibility. And there, as I said, the hiring restrictions have been an absolute stranglehold on our ability. It takes me now to get someone on my staff somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 8 months after we do the offer. And that is just unacceptable. And there are exceptions that you know, as the Mandarins know, called Schedule A, that we can use to expedite, but that is controlled by OMB. And whether or not OMB decides to give that power to the directors and then review it is a real set of issues. And you know, the last administration, we had Flash, which tried to bring in we had someone from Google, I think, who came in to try to revolutionize how to go forward with hiring and projects. And again, the bureaucracy's ability to crush that is legendary. So my sense is, those of us have all been victims, and though I love all of the hiring bureaucrats and attorneys, as you can imagine, many of them my former students, that tension has become a real issue for us to be agile. And that's where I could see a lot of potential for the executive branch and the Congress to work together to try to expedite that in certain pilot projects and ways of going forward. And we're going to try and do it and see what happens. But if we fail, then we will go the way of the Roman Empire, where in the end it was difficult for the Romans actually to amass their legions to move out. And I think that's a huge problem if we confront that ability to be able to be that flexible and powerful to react to the problems. But you have to be aware, as you know, when the Congress acts, to make sure it's doing it in an informed way.
So, thank you all for appearing here, and thank you for writing this updated book.
You might identify who you are. It's always important.
Sure. I'm Morgan Berndyken. I'm a final semester student here at SSP.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Yeah. Well, if there's a lawsuit, I'm happy to speak to you about it.
All right, great. I'll get your card afterwards.
Okay.
So you kind of mentioned that we've seen these potential momentous occasions over the last decade and a half of major, massive leaks of classified information. And at the same time, for the past 2 decades, there's kind of been this continuing trend that a lot of people on different sides of the national security enterprise have noted of overclassification. So we've got these two problems that are in kind of competition with each other, where there's information that's going out, and simultaneously there's information that's coming in and being restricted that maybe shouldn't be. I'm curious if you guys could talk a little bit about the problem of overclassification from the different angles of the national security enterprise, and whether or not trying to tackle that problem is potentially more core to solving things like a hiring process where literally everyone has to have some clearance of some kind to work on literally anything, even minutely related to the national security enterprise.
So the NDAA, Section 951 that we're debating, is who will control the process for background checks. And I've been deeply involved in that issue for different varieties, either when I checked myself or when I was helping to oversee it for the counterintelligence. That's a big issue. And having the right capacity and capability to bring people on board. And my hope is that we'll be able to use what I would call and exploit the big data issue in order for us to be much better at understanding what the risk factor is of hiring individuals. Right now, one of my clearances is being re-upped. So I'm getting calls from people from all over the country and my neighbors saying, I told them you were okay. Is that okay? I said, yeah, it's okay. So, but that process is, for me, it's almost a 19th or 18th century way of understanding what a risk factor is. And we have a number of companies that are being involved that are in the defense industrial base that are exploiting databases and exploiting them in a way for the relationship of telling signs for a fear. So that I think is recognized and go forward. And that's important, and where that resides, because I think most of us in this room, as you know, the OMB penetration had quite a dramatic impact vis-a-vis our adversaries who now have all our SF-86s. I've been told the upside is that the adversary seems to have a better filing system than we did, so it might be easier actually to check our files down the road. But that penetration is devastating, and it's a demonstration for us to have to be serious about it. And then your other issue, overclassification, all of us have been involved in this process. And remember, if you remember Senator Monahan from the great state of New York, this is one of his pet peeves, was the overclassification issue. And I concur we could do a much better job of that declassification so that we could actually start focusing on what we think are the core issues. But the second problem with that is, in the modern capacity for data, which you'd be stunned to see how you can correlate metadata that does not appear to be particularly significant or classified. And when you rack and stack a whole range of databases to be able to make correlations, you can make and have conclusions that from an intelligence perspective are devastating. And that's another sort of new concern about what we really need to classify and what is in the wild. And the ability to get that information in the wild and use data mining is a whole new world for us that we'll have to sort of confront with. And that old classification system may not have been sufficient, and now in the modern age may prove to be also a problem of insufficiency as to what we should be concerned about of how we go forward.
I guess the only thing I'd add is, the FOIA process at CIA, at least when I looked at it, was incredibly labor intensive, because you can imagine all the FOIA requests we get to declassify some document, and it means you have to hire staff, usually contractors, who are former employees who have clearances. That ups the cost right there, who then have to painstakingly go through every document, decide if this sentence is still classified secret or top secret or whatever. And then you get an adjudication process, see if this person has properly evaluated it before the entire document with all the blacked out redacted parts can be released to the journalists or the academic. Multiply that by thousands. I mean, it costs a lot of money for CIA to run a FOIA operation, and frankly, they'd rather be spending their dollars on analysts doing work rather than helping out the journalists and the academics. Now, having said that, being now an academic, I love getting access to legitimately declassified documents that I can show a student this is what a national intelligence estimate looks like, feels like, kind of judgments we make on important issues. So there is a balancing effort, but it is so costly. And maybe if Harvey's correct, and big data and keywords or metadata can help us accelerate that process, I'm all for it.
Just as a footnote, at one point in my career, I was asked to be involved with the FOIA for the Kennedy assassination for the Bureau. And there was a document that came up, and it was decided that we would not release it. And again, the Senate was very upset. And so I was asked to go up to the Senate to explain why we're holding on to this particular data. And it turned out that it was before my time, but Mr. Hoover had decided that the reporters in Dallas would be followed by agents. And one of the reporters had an agent following him. And the night before President Kennedy arrived, this individual had decided to have a liaison with a local resident of the Dallas community for an exchange of financial remuneration. And this was all recorded. And we explained why we were not going to release this because it was a rather prominent reporter still alive. And we didn't think it was appropriate for his family to be embarrassed this way. And when we explained it to the senators, they understood immediately why we were being prudent in releasing it. We were kind of curious. And Mr. Hoover followed them at any point in their careers. To which I said, well, that was outside of my jurisdiction. I was just doing the FOIA for the Kennedy assassination. And that, but even then, 30, 40 years later, there are reasons why you do not want to make information public. And it was more of the personal embarrassment that would have then ensued if that document is done. So the rule we had at the Supreme Court was, which has not been followed, but my generation was, any justice's papers could not be released to the public unless every co-justice they had served with died, passed away. Because the justices had recorded rather personal assessments of some of the legal reasoning of their colleagues, which always were not the most positive. And that was the rule until Justice Blackmun took his papers after he passed away and were placed in the archives, and they were being accessed by individuals, and a number of the justices he served still were alive. But that's another way why we do that length of, but once it's done, it's sort of like the way the Brits do it with their act, it makes sense to say, okay, and justices whose papers will be made public, but there's a timeline for it. Mark, I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Just quickly, I think the questions are really twofold. Kind of, what's the information for, and how do we get it? So, if the and I think if you can answer those two questions, it gives you a lot of scope to then understand what might or might not be classified. So, if information is for making better decisions for principals, right, and for the bosses, and it's information that came from sources and methods, well, it seems to me that ought to stay classified, and should stay classified for a very long time. I think Roger will back me up, though, that the vast majority of information that's collected by the United States of America, certainly on the State Department side, is open source, right? And then it goes into kind of the machine, and it gets caught up in a lot of this sort of overclassification. And then the second question for me, the second category is also, having been kind of a senior official, and certainly when I was serving abroad, is actually, I'd like my recommendations to my bosses to stay private as well. Because that's the only way that you can really do this, is if you can have an honest conversation with the people above you. You can't speak truth to power if it's going to end up, with Julian Assange. And so that's a second category of area where things ought to stay quiet.
See, Mark, I thought you were going to go a different way, that you wanted them made public because they were always so right.
No. The third thing, though, is the challenge, which is what I said in my presentation, and Harvey alluded to as well, is that a third category of information is now larger and larger and larger. It's information that I need when I represent the United States abroad to persuade a foreign public of our point of view. And so you think about things that are currently classified, and you say, gosh, if I could use some of this information, I could really make a better case to the public. I think about the difference between Title 10 and Title 50 drone strikes, for example. And so, there are a lot of questions here, and I think the third of those questions is, how can you get the most information to the people at the front of this effort to be the most persuasive to foreign publics about the goals and interests of the United States? That's an expanding universe, and that argues for kind of as little classification as you can do, protecting the questions of sources and methods, protecting the questions of recommendations.
I'll just throw in one other comment.
One more question.
Let me just throw in a comment here. On WikiLeaks, as a government employee, I couldn't read WikiLeaks.
Right.
It's not legal. But what the New York Times told me was that most of the State Department cables that were released, when read by reporters who were pretty knowledgeable, wow, how sensible and incisive and on the mark these State Department cables were. The downside was we lost at least one ambassador for being so candid. Our ambassador to Mexico was asked to leave, essentially, because he was frankly speaking truth to power back in Washington, but he didn't want to say to the face of the Mexican president what he did in the cable.
As I told you at the time, you just need a higher classification to read them. Sir.
Yeah, so I'm Peter Clement. I'm currently at the agency, and I'm it's a great book.
And also an adjunct professor,
Yes.
when he'll come back to us.
I hope so. Yeah. So my question's really for you, Ambassador Grossman. I love your presentation, and it would seem logical that with all the people who think there's a dire need for change within the bureaucracy,
Right.
this should be a no-brainer.
It is.
And yet, everything you read in the newspapers and what's coming out gets to one of the deeper questions about, well, why can't they make this work? And what I read in the papers is the people leading the change on the 7th floor are not actually looking for the inputs and getting buy-in by getting the careerists to engage in this process and contribute to this rebuilding or reforming or restructuring. And I say this watching the agency because we recently had a modernization, right? And I thought it was a little more inclusive, but let me tell you, the cultural issues that it stepped on, as you do that, I'm sure in all these different agencies, it's amazing how the cultural structures and just baggage can get in the way. And I don't know, do you feel that that's one of the issues at stake maybe?
No, I think actually what's more kind of going on now, and again, I'm just from the outside like you, I read the newspaper and try to observe, is a little bit to the point that Roger made. I think people, once President Trump got elected, he appointed officials. Those officials, like Secretary Tillerson, came to the State Department. And I would imagine that in Secretary Tillerson's head was this idea that he was about to take over the enemy, right? The hotbed of globalists and the hotbed of internationalists and all these people who were interested in all the things that, his president was and had run against, right? And so, and so I think that, a little bit, if they had read this chapter, but I think that they came with a prejudice, which is to say, everybody in this place will do everything they can to defend the way that it is. And therefore, I'm in a war here if I want to reform it. And the message of a lot of people, both inside the department and for some of us kind of uselessly outside, was don't take that as your assumption. That you have, at least at a certain level in the department, a number of officers kind of at the DAS and assistant secretary level, and I think below too, the younger people that we brought in over the past few years, who recognize that this place has to change, right? It can't be the way it is forever. And that that calling on the culture that says, I'm a patriot, I want this job to be done, and oh, by the way, please lead me, right? I want to be led. I want to be part of something that's happening. That there was an opportunity, and I don't think that opportunity is 100% gone, but it's a challenge. There was an opportunity for people to say, come on, we can do this together. And as I said, I think if you took a poll at the State Department, 99.9% of Foreign Service and Civil Service people would have said, one deputy instead of two? Absolutely. And 88% of the people would have said, I'm just guessing these numbers, but a lot of people would have said, less special envoys rather than more? Absolutely. And oh, please, can you get rid of my deputy director because they're only in the way? right? I can't get my work done. And why do I have to clear everything with, this office and that office, because they're using clearances to keep informed and not to add value? So I had this fantasy that really a reorganization which would help get the work done, I think people who would pursue that would be carried out of the place on, as heroes. The question is this, and then I'll stop, which is right now, I think people are saying, Secretary Tillerson, I want to make the State Department more efficient. That's a really important thing. The question is, I want to make the State Department more effective, of which efficiency is a piece, right? And I think that's part of the, if you'll kind of expand the question a little bit here to effectiveness and not just efficiency, everybody might have a chance to benefit here.
So it's a great question because like many of us, I've been involved in many attempts to change institutions, and I would say there always is in these organizations pockets of elements that just do not want change.
Sure.
And how you're able to deal with their ability to be veto power is a true issue of leadership. So I will tell you, think of the two most successful entities in the private sector who have been able to navigate change quite elegantly. And one is Goldman Sachs. So you think of Goldman Sachs and its competition inside investment banking and its sustainability over time. It's a fascinating case study of how they were able to institutionalize that capacity. And one of them was, they're one of the first entities that had the 360 review, in which you're not only reviewed by your superiors, but you're reviewed by your peers and your subordinates. And it's why when you meet Goldman Sachs partners, they're extraordinarily talented in the way they present themselves and the way they navigate issues, because of their understanding that they will be reviewed by their subordinates about how they act and their peers. And then the other extraordinary institution is, let's say, take Google. And think of Google's capacity of flexibility inside their workspace. So when we go to our offices, you always have the 7th floor, the corner office, the phalanx of individuals that surround the director or the. And at Google, the highest levels, so when you go to their offices, their own people running the enterprise, let's say you take a Pittsburgh enterprise, that person doesn't have even their own office. They don't even have their dedicated space. If they want to do a conference call, they have to actually book it the way that, it's such a different understanding of what leadership is for that level of flexibility. Think of Bloomberg when he was mayor. So it's an amazing picture when Bloomberg is mayor. He's sitting in the big bullpen with him in the center in the cubicle, surrounded by his entire core staff. And I would argue that during those years, New York was probably run the most efficiently and effectively, but understanding that flexibility. I think it's very hard, and as all of us know, when you do the interagency process, how the different elements bring their equities. And we have what I call the algorithm of the mandarins. And the algorithm of the mandarins is you always are about your jurisdiction, because your jurisdiction comes with your FTEs and your budget. And that tension inside our bureaucratic process is always at loggerheads. Let's take the State Department. So who's going to visit this? Who's going to run this desk? The Cuban desk, the Southern Cone, the terrorists? How do you coordinate your elements to feel comfortable to go forward with a policy is hard. Right, but that to me has always been an issue when we try to reorganize the systems.
That's absolutely right. But there is a place where, and we talked about it in the book, there is a place where this does work, right? Which is country teams.
Yes.
And country teams abroad, are actually, if they're properly led, if you have an ambassador and she or he is doing their job, that the country team is actually a quite interesting and very effective way to mobilize the whole of government.
Mm-hmm.
And why is that? And the reason is, partially it's a question of leadership, but partially it's also because the chief of mission has a letter from the President of the United States. And the President of the United States says to the chief of mission, you are responsible for everything that's going on in this country, with the exception of those military officers, those military people deployed under the charge of a combatant commander. But other than that, this is yours, right? You're responsible for this. And if you think about it, and here, this is just fantasy on my part, I recognize, but there's no similar structure in Washington, D.C. Right? And so I got it, I recognize my bias. But just think for a minute, if the Assistant Secretary of State for the Regional Bureau had a corresponding letter from the President of the United States. And so when she or he sat at the interagency table, they would say, I like your views, I need them, we're going to do just like we do with the country team. But in the end, the President is going to look at me and say, you are responsible for this because I have this letter. And what do we tell new ambassadors when they're going to post? We say, that letter is like the most fantastic thing you could get. It's the greatest gift you can give, right? Yeah. But if you ever have to whip it out of your safe and wave it at somebody and read it to them, it's too late, right? You haven't done your work. And so why not impose that same discipline at the Washington end in some fashion? Because this works abroad and there's no reason it couldn't work here.
So I totally agree. And so almost all ambassadors, that chief of mission letter is so powerful. And the great ambassador like Crawford, well known as being extraordinary leaders. But as you know, part of that issue is what you pointed out. When you contrast the State Department's chief of mission's capabilities and assets in contrast to combat commander,
Right.
and those assets and at their disposal. And we always said it's been fascinating how the COCOMs, like when we took AFRICOM, we stood up the political advisor being in second in command, a State Department person.
Right.
That was the real integration, which we would know as Clausewitzian integration of both the diplomacy and the power.
Right.
Because now we've set up, as you know, the famous examples of, in Saudi Arabia, the king saying they would prefer to have the COCOM commander sitting beside them versus the ambassador. And the COCOM commander's area of responsibility spans much greater than the single ambassador. And trying to figure out, we've always had to tinker with those issues
Right.
to create co-commitment power between the two entities, despite the huge budget differences, is a way of thinking through of getting the policy sectors together. And as we said, in the State Department, the great ambassadors like you have really come up through the ranks and have that level of expertise that we normally associate with the COCOM, with the commanders who've gone through every rank of leadership. And coordinating that, which we used to work on how to get that at state, those would be great ways of trying to create that balance. And then it's integrating, how do you integrate the intelligence community and the chief of mission, chief of station in that process. That's when you have the real triumvirate of power in the system. But it's been much easier to do it abroad than it has been done, as Mark was saying, domestically.
We never tried it.
Oh my God, the camera was going. You have to step in front to say who you are.
So my name's Tina. I'm currently a first year here at SSP. I have to admit I haven't read your books, so I don't know if this has been addressed in it yet, but I have to ask what your thoughts are on red teaming and whether or not you think that's effective in bringing about change in these agencies.
Well, I guess in my sense I was saying the cyber realm, I'm a huge fan of the red team. I'm a huge fan, like I don't know when the last time Georgetown Network was attacked.
Every day.
But attacked in a way by skillful people you paid to do it.
Oh, by us, our
Yeah.
own, yes. Yeah, we've been attacked by the enemy.
Yes,
Sure,
but-
but yeah, not ours.
But the red teaming to do that is a great process. And in our experiences in government, it's always been good to get a series of experts, read them in, let them go at it and see how you feel about it. So that's been, for me, it's very powerful. I don't know if you guys.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of red teaming, red cells, and they use them in the Director of Analysis at CIA and also at DIA to kind of challenge the conventional line analysis from time to time. The only danger there is sometimes it becomes sort of a box checking exercise. Oh, well, we got the red cell, they've done their analysis, now we'll move back. We check, it's like having the Maytag repairman come and say everything's okay, but then next week,
Thank you
the washer goes out. But I think they're useful checks on, hidden assumptions that we all carry, whether it's about a reorganization plan or an analysis. I recall when we were at the National War College, we sent a group of our students down for a war game exercise vis-a-vis Iran. And all the war colleges sent their teams, and I think ours got to play Iran, and they had kind of a red team attitude, and they went at the game in a very unconventional way, and they stopped the game. They said, you're not playing it the way we wanted you to play it. It's kind of defeats the whole purpose, right? But I think that's the problem. We have a conventional view of how Iran's going to behave, and North Korea, and we're not prepared to think outside the box and, gosh, what if he doesn't think that way? Are we prepared for that?
Can I just say to people who are younger in this room, I beg you, watch the Ken Burns PBS series on Vietnam. Because it's about groupthink, and it's about red teams, and it's about expectations, and it's about a lot of the challenges that we have today. I'm not. I apologize. I have no financial interest in this either. But so I'm not trying to sell PBS here. But truly, this is compelling stuff about how governments work and how governments don't work, and how sacrifices are made, and how leadership and people at the front of leadership get connected. And if I might just say, it's also red team, very important. But I think also, just to go back to the chapter on the State Department, and I recognize it's not a red team, but you made me think about it, and I just want to say it out loud, is that the goal of red teaming, of course, is to have people around the table who are saying, wait a minute, think about this in a different way. And so I would just say that one of the great changes in the State Department in the last 60 or 70 years has been some more diversity at the State Department. Because 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and no disrespect to people who went to Harvard and Yale and Princeton, but everybody was white and went to Yale. And our classes today are really different than that. And what we tell, again, I talk to people who are about to kind of go out abroad and be chiefs of mission, or about to lead lots of people. And I say, if you look around the table and everybody looks like you, then you're not getting the benefit of kind of a larger view. That's not red teaming, but I think it's a really important difference in the culture of the State Department. That's a different thing and a positive thing, and I hope will continue to be true.
So Mark, I totally understand your attack on Yale and Princeton. I thought you were going to raise the dissent channel that you have at the State Department.
Yes.
And that dissent channel is a unique process that many other institutions we don't have that's been very effective.
Also grounded in the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
That's a Vietnam era
Innovation.
process.
Yeah. Sir.
Joe McMillan, ex-OSD Mandarin.
We recognize you.
Former member.
We recognize
On the red teaming issue, I would say within DoD, we do a fair amount of either red teaming or things that approach red teaming. For us, there's also the element that part of the organizational culture kind of approximates a red team approach, because the DoD's decision-making process, I think in contrast to state, although Mark is much more inside state than I ever was, is much more combative and contentious. And so the analogy of the secretary being the emperor and watching the gladiators fight and giving the thumbs up, the thumb down. So there is sort of internal challenging that when the combatant command comes up with some scheme, you have people in OSD, people in the services and elsewhere, all challenging that and forcing the secretary to, when it's running properly, forcing the secretary to confront these tensions among the different pros and cons. Where I found it harder is on the process and structure side. So substantively, I thought we did a fair job of red teaming. But when we would bring red teams in, or outsiders in, to look at how we did business, I don't remember it ever working. And I think there were two reasons why it didn't. We had McKinsey come in,
Sure.
Michelle Flournoy had the
Yeah.
McKinsey people come in and look at how policy did business. And one of the things that they came up with was decision process is too slow. Paper moves too slowly, things take forever. So how can we fix this? Well, the obvious answer to fixing is to delayer the bureaucracy. But we don't want to hurt anybody. If we delayer people, that means all of these senior folks who have tenure, you gotta get rid of, and that's hard to get rid of people. Or you have to stop hiring and wait for it to delayer, and then you don't have the intake. So that's too hard. And then we're also hampered by the whole personnel structure that makes, in the civil service, makes rank depend on how many people you supervise. Well, I don't give a crap whether the expert in the department on the Philippines supervises one person, no people, or 30 people. I want to get the best person that I can find to advise the secretary on Philippine policy. But the personnel system says I can't pay him what he's worth unless he's supervising at least X number of people. So we actually, in DOD and OSD, actually created supervisory positions that no one thought we needed for the purpose of providing supervisory experience to qualify people for promotion. And now we can't, and now they can't get rid of them. If you're not inside all of this, and if you don't live with it, the red team people come in from outside. And the other solution was, from the political folks, was, well, we'll just reduce the number of people who touch any piece of paper. Only 2 people, the action officer, the secretary, the action officer, the undersecretary, only 2 people can touch the piece of paper. Great. Well, what we do is paper. So if the deputy director and the principal director and the principal DASD aren't going to make an input to the paper, why don't we get rid of them? Oh, can't do that. That makes my organization smaller, makes my budget smaller.
Right.
As Harvey said, that's going around.
So we're gonna have to wrap it up, but I want to thank, unless you guys have an opportunity, but I will say the famous briefing that Curtis LeMay received about what the enemy was doing. And LeMay, the briefer finishes, and LeMay looks at the Air Force and goes, well, I worry about the real enemy. And the young lieutenant goes, sir? He goes, what's the Army doing?
Yeah, that's inner service culture. Well, so please, just a second, we'd like to thank everybody, this great panel here, this great book that everybody is going to read, and I'd like to give each of you a token from the Security Studies program, our coin, which says, of course, theory and practice, policy and scholarship, which I think your book certainly embodies, and so it's a great contribution to all of us here at the Security Studies program. So
Thank you.
Harvey.
So, I